Midway on our life's journey, I found myself in dark woods, the right road lost. To tell about those woods is hard, so tangled and rough and savage that, thinking of it now, I feel the old fear stirring. Death is hardly more bitter. And yet, to treat the good I found there as well, I'll tell what I saw. As one still panting ashore from dangerous seas looks back at the deep he has escaped, my thought returns, still fleeing, to regard that grim defile that never left any alive who stayed in it.
All right, joining us this week on Scum and Villainy Radio is Star Wars author Troy Denning. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great.
Oh, thanks for coming on. So, you've been a pretty influential figure in the Star Wars expanded universe. Would you like to tell us a little bit about how you first got into writing for Star Wars?
My first project was West End Games Galaxy Guide 4. Just about as much fun as a game designer can have. It was pretty much a dream come true. What had happened was somebody who had worked for me, who had gone to college with, and who had worked for me at TSR, had gone to West End Games and become their manager of design. And he knew that I was very interested in Star Wars, that I loved it. And so when they got the Star Wars license, he contacted me and said, "Hey, how would you like to do some Star Wars projects for us?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I could do that." And so the first job he gave me was to go through the list of unknown characters and species in the cantina scene, and he said, "All right, write up backgrounds for all of these guys so that we know what they are and what kind of species they are and so forth." And so it was fun. And my wife, who was a game editor, wrote the description for the Hutts, and she is the reason that they changed sex in the middle of their life cycle.
Interesting.
She wrote that up and said, "All right, this is what the Hutts are," and because she was very much into biology in college, and so she understood all of that stuff. And I was like reading that, and I was like, "Well, what do you mean they changed sex?" And she's like, "No, it's a real thing. Slugs do it all the time."
Right.
Well, then, after the West End Games, you also did some Choose Your Own Adventure and little modules like that. How did then your involvement with the New Jedi Order happen almost, 10, 15 years after that?
I started writing for the Forgotten Realms for TSR.
My good friend, Bob Salvatore, and of course, our friends, we wrote together in the Forgotten Realms. And Bob is the reason that I was asked to write in Star Wars, because he knew that I was interested in Star Wars. He was writing Vector Prime, and he said, "Hey, call up Troy, see if he wants to participate in this. He'd be a great addition."
Bob told me, "Hey, Del Rey is doing some Star Wars stuff, and, if you'd be interested, you should contact them because they know who you are and they know that you have an interest in Star Wars." So he gave me the contact information, and I sent Shelley a letter, I think it was at the time, because that even that was so far back that that it was in the day of dot matrix printers. so I sent her a letter, was introducing myself and telling her what I'd written, and sent her a couple of samples of work, and she got back to me within a few weeks saying, "Yeah, we're definitely interested. We'll do something with you." And so a month later, nothing had come along, and called her up and said, "Anything?" And she said, "Not yet." And then another month later, I called her up and said, "Anything?" And she said, "Not yet." So I did it one more time. So it was like 3 months and nothing was happening. And I figured, okay, this just isn't going to happen. So I just kind of gave up. And then about 4 months after that, I get a call out of the blue and said, "Okay, we're ready to make an offer." Okay, I'll get an outline together for you. Well, we don't really need a proposal. We know what we want you to write. And I said, "Okay, what is that?" And she said, "I can't tell you." "Oh, okay. I guess I'll sign the contract."
So you had to sign it without knowing exactly what you were going to be writing about.
Yeah, exactly. Because it was, of course, the New Jedi Order.
Yep.
It was a big secret, and at the time we were negotiating this, Vector Prime still hadn't quite come out. So I finally get the contract, and a couple of weeks after that, I get the story Bible, and I see that my friend Bob Salvatore is writing Vector Prime. And I'm going through all the plot points for all 21, it was 21 books at the time. Going through all the plot points, and of course, this is the first one, and I get through it, and I read, Chewbacca died. I'm like, I don't even get any further than that. I get on the phone and call him, oh my God, you killed Chewbacca! You killed Chewbacca! He looks at me and he says, you haven't finished reading the Bible, have you? So I go back and read the Bible, and of course I'm thinking I'm killing Han or some damn thing. And I was actually kind of relieved to see it was only, Anakin. It was still quite a shock.
And at this point, Vector Prime hadn't come out yet. Nobody had read it except the proofreaders, right? So I'm reading through the plot points for Vector Prime, and I get to the part where Chewbacca dies. And I call up my friend Bob Salvatore, and I said, you killed Chewbacca, I didn't even get past that. And he kind of gets quiet for a minute, and then he starts laughing, and he says, wait till you see who you kill.
Wow.
It's like, what? And so then I flipped ahead to my book and go down there, and I'm like reading all the stuff that happens in that. Anakin Solo dies. Oh my God. Curse
That is so
God.
intense.
Oh my God. And I was like, oh, now I see why they wanted me to sign the contract before they told me what I was writing. When I saw what happened in that book, I knew, all right, this is going to be either a book that makes me or breaks me. Because after this, I will never have trouble getting another book to write again, or I will never be able to write another book. And it'll all depend on how I handle it.
Did you find it kind of intimidating that in your first, book in this franchise, you had to kill off a character like that?
Yeah, well, it was a little bit intimidating, and it was also, not only that, but Coruscant Falls, and that was, to my mind, almost as big a deal as killing Anakin. So it was a big surprise, and it was intimidating, but also, I took one look at the list of plot points that they had in the original story Bible, and I realized it was going to be a big, big book. So, and big in terms of being pivotal. And so I was really excited about doing it. And then we had a story meeting right before I was writing the outline. So we all flew out to Skywalker Ranch and had a meeting and talked about how the story was progressing so far and what we were going to add to the story and needed to take from the story. And at this meeting, they just kept pulling things that hadn't quite gotten done in the earlier books and putting them back into Star by Star, or the book that would become Star by Star. And then they started to look at the later books, and they were worried about pacing, so they started moving some of the things that were in those later books back into Star by Star. And so we started adding all these plot points to the already long list of plot points I had. And we go to dinner that night, and I look at Shelley, and I said, Shelley, we've got to talk about the length of this book. He said, well, you don't think you'll have enough material? And I said, no, I'm kind of worried about the opposite. I think it's going to take me probably twice as many words as we have contracted to write this book. And she said, well, is that a problem? And I said, well, not for me if it's not for you. But I had been writing in for lines where they didn't want you to go too much over the contract length. And she kind of looked at me and she said, oh, don't worry, you can go over as long as you want. That was kind of the story. It took quite a while to write the book, too, of course, because it was such a long one. But,
yeah, I believe it was around 624 pages.
Yeah, yep.
So, what was it like working with such an ensemble cast of writers on such a large series like that, as far as, maybe different from previous experiences that you had where you would just be working on something by yourself?
Well, it was quite a bit different. It was a lot more fun. The brainstorming sessions that we had at Skywalker Ranch were just a blast. I mean, first you got to go to Skywalker Ranch, and that was really cool. We got to, have tours of it. And I got to see the staircase that led to George Lucas's office, which was as close as anybody gets to his office, I guess. Actually, at the time that I was there, they were casting, and the girl who played Zam Wesell, the bounty hunter, shapeshifter,
Yep.
she was actually
apparently in contract negotiations or anything, but she was running around there at the time, and I didn't recognize her until later in the movies, and it was like, oh, wait a minute, she was at
You never know who you're going to run into up there.
yeah. So it was pretty cool. I mean, it was very, very cool to be involved in that. Because there were so many different authors involved, it became a little bit more of a coordination headache than even the later series that I was involved with, because you're coordinating with guys that are only going to be involved for a book or two, and, trying to get everything. It would be nailing it from in front of me, what everybody was going to do there, and then nailing it for the 3 books and behind me.
Yeah, and of course you worked a lot more closely with the people that were closer to your book. So it was kind of interesting. I'd be working like with Matt Stover. We'd be sending emails back and forth, and he'd say, I want you to do this, and then like a week later he'd say, no, I want you to do this, and it'd be going back and forth because he would be, as he was writing, he would have ideas that would occur to him, and he was experimenting and playing with it, and I knew how that worked, but he was very fluid in terms of his own story. So because I had to coordinate with him on what Vigaria was doing,
he was trying to make up his mind where he was going with Trader, and at one point I just said, Matt, I wrote him an email, you got to stop. Make up your mind. I'm 500 pages through my book. I need to know what you want. And finally he said, oh, okay, do it this way.
And I'm sure I did that to the people that I followed too, to a certain extent. And I remember Kathy Tyer's book. I had read the outline, and then I think the Star by Star manuscript was 800 pages, and I was about 400 through it when I got Kathy Tyer's book in her final draft, and saw that, holy cow, that's, she did everything that she said she was going to do in the outline, but it was all about 15% off of what I had expected. Just
Right.
Between her interpretation of the characters was a little bit different than what I had expected it to be. And so I had to go back and redo all my characters in the first 400 pages of the story, and kind of angle them in a slightly different way to maintain the continuity. So that was a real learning process. It was a huge learning curve, I know, for the editors too, because as crazy as it was for each author, they were trying to stay on top of all of the authors, and I don't think that they actually were able to stay informed about all of the communications between the different authors.
Right.
It just would have been impossible. But they were, in charge of kind of coordinating the final outcome. And so something would come in that was slightly off of what they expected, but the 2 authors involved had all been in communication and were all fine with it. Then it would have to affect a whole different group of authors. And then they would have to handle that coordination.
Yeah.
It was a truly unique product. I don't know if anything's ever been attempted before like that or since.
No, there really hasn't been. Not in that scope.
Yeah.
Even now, looking back at the New Jedi Order, the scope that series had and kind of the foresight and how that was all planned.
Yeah, it was the first time that they had tried something like that. And they were using a huge cast of authors. I mean, they were, I think, originally like 22 or 23 books to be included in the series. No author was going to write more than 2 or 3, I think, is what they had decided. So they were, going through authors like you couldn't believe, just burning through them. And Bob was just finishing up Vector Prime when I was starting Star by Star. So that's the kind of lead times that were involved, and everybody who published in between us was still writing, and we were all trying to coordinate with each other, make sure that the story was, the story in the book that followed Vector Prime was going to be the story I expected when I got to Star by Star. So there was, I don't even want to think about how many thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, and maybe even 100,000 emails, were generated for that project. It was just massive amount of emailing.
As many pages as we wrote in manuscript, probably wrote that many pages again in emails.
With NGO, we were all writing kind of overlapping stories. Greg was writing the ends of his stories. I was writing Star by Star, and then Lane was starting to do Dark Journey right after, as I was finishing up Star by Star, and we had to work together and adjust our stories and do a lot of coordinating that way. Basically, when you start the process, you have a starting point. They say this is the situation at your starting point, and this is the situation at your ending point, and you're free to do pretty much anything you need to in between those points. And so, for instance, when I was doing Star by Star, I introduced the Voxen. That was something that I felt I needed to have for my story, and it hadn't existed before I did my outline, and Greg was working on his stories, and they weren't, in that. And I said, well, I'm going to have these Voxen in the stories. And Greg said, well, would you like me to foreshadow them a little bit in this story? I could do it this way. And so that's where the coordination comes through. And of course, I did a few things with, for instance, for Elaine, she said, okay, I want to start my story at this point, which meant that I had to add like one little chapter, the chapter where they were flying away from the planet, because I had intended to end that on the planet.
Okay.
But she wanted to start it in the beginning, and she said, wouldn't it be neat if we could just start it, seconds after your book ends? And I said, okay, well, that'll be great. So, I had to, add a little bit for that, and it all worked out just perfectly. And it, I think because of all the people involved were so good-willed and so eager to work with each other.
From the time of Vector Prime to Star by Star, did the NGO storyline evolve, change path from where the basic storyline was done?
Oh yeah, the basic ideas were still set, but how you get there has changed a great deal. There are several versions of the Bible because it gets updated as new ideas come along.
Which part of Star by Star were your initiative, and what others were from a strict storyline from Del Rey?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. Let's see. I remember that the original contract, when I read it, because I had to sign the contract to do the book before I read the Bible. But I think that when I read what I was going to be doing, my jaw kind of dropped, because at that point I read about Anakin's fate in the outline that I had been given for what was going to be accomplished, and I read that Coruscant was to fall. And there were a few other things, but those are the big ones that stick out in my mind. And so it became up to me, my job, to decide how I was going to make that happen. And when I started to work through my plot and so forth, I said, well, I don't want him to fall for some minor problem, just in the course of a battle or something. It has to be something major that's going to be really important. And so that's where the idea of the Voxen began to develop.
At one point, you had to kill Anakin Solo in some way. Did you have different ideas on how his death could be portrayed, and describe the difficulty to write the death of a major character like Anakin?
Yeah, that was, when I read that, I knew that it was going to be the single most important event in the book, and was going to either make it or break it. And so I decided I would have to pay a lot of attention to it. And the first thing I decided was that he wasn't going to go alone. That it wasn't just going to be, he's out walking some night and the Yuuzhan Vong gets him or something. It had to be something that had a tremendous impact. And so I decided, well, I'm going to have to bring in a bunch of, some other Jedi are going to have to go with him, because it's going to have to be a big battle. It's going to have to be something desperate. And then I decided, well, I don't really want to start killing off a bunch of named Jedi that are already in existence. So I invented a bunch that I could use for that purpose. So that was one of the goals that I had, or one of the ideas I had to try and make the death worthy. And of course, the Voxen, as we've already discussed, they were the threat that was significant enough to the New Jedi Order, or to the Jedi themselves, to justify the desperate mission that they had to undertake.
The writing team said, all right, we're going to up the ante, we're going to raise the stakes. And obviously, when we opened up with the Vector Prime, R.A. Salvatore's first novel, the first foray in New Jedi Order, we begin with a bang. We witness Chewie's epic death, right? He stands, he shouts at the moon, and this very colorful and tragic scene going on there. Obviously, Han Solo's child, Anakin Solo, is saved. But we get to book number 9 by you, Star by Star. And it has arguably some of the most significant events in the expanded universe. we have the Jedi strike team who is assigned to the mission on Merkur to go and destroy this Voxan Queen, and they do succeed, but at a very great cost. We have this tragic loss of the youngest of the Solo children, Anakin. How did the decision of killing a major character come about?
I can confirm that it was always part of the plan from the time Del Rey took over the license to kill Chewbacca and then to kill Anakin. You have to remember that Bantam ceded the license and Del Rey took the license over. And the editors at Del Rey, Shelley Shapiro, Kuyu Lang, and Steve Saffel, had a very strong sense that there was no peril left. The heroes were never in danger. And that was just a function of the licensing world at the time. And so when they took it over, I imagine them having a conversation with Lucasfilm that went something like this: we're not going to do that unless you let us kill some characters. And Lucasfilm went along. And of course, that's how it came up to begin the series. I mean, Vector Prime was their first book in that whole series.
Yeah.
Del Rey's first book after they took over the license. And they began it with killing Chewie. So, and that was to let them know that you were serious. And then 9 books later, this was part of their plan from the beginning, even before I was on board, was to kill Anakin in the 9th book. And so that was always part of the plan.
How hard was it for you to write and do what you had to do? I'm not trying to be like a mean person. I'm really wondering, because I heard that you kind of did it against your will, that you threw you out of the draft. I was wondering how you felt when you were writing.
I guess it wouldn't be fair to say that I did it against my will, but it would be fair to say that when I signed the contract, I wasn't aware of what I had to do. I didn't get to look at the plot points until afterwards, and so it was a bit of a surprise. And at that point, I decided, well, I don't really want him to go out alone. It seemed like there should be a bigger impact than that. So I decided I would have him go out as part of a team, and had really got into trouble. And I think it was Shelley or Sue Rostoni who suggested reading the Young Jedi Knights books. I read them, and I just loved them, and they were great. By the time I finished them, my original intention was to kill off about half of them. But by the time I finished reading them, I had come to love the characters so much that I just couldn't bring myself to do it. So I invented a whole bunch of new Young Jedi Knights that I couldn't kill without killing the ones I grown to love. So it was hard, but it wasn't something that I did against my will. Because it was the right thing to do for that story at that time. It really needed to have that pivot point. But it was very, very hard. I wrote that chapter about 8 times before I finally said, okay, I really have to do it.
I'm actually just as kind of related to that. I mean, how difficult was it for you to write the emotional fallout, for his family? Because those are really, maybe more so than Anakin's death scene. That, those are the parts that really got to me.
Yeah, in the first draft, I skipped that. I had written it, and then I jumped right to the next action scene. I think because I didn't really want to write that painful part. But that was really worked out to be a great thing to do, because by skipping it, I got a little bit of distance. And then when I came back to it, I could see what really needed to be done and how to make it work. I think it worked pretty well. I was happy with it.
I cried.
Me too. I understand.
And I just remember the whole sequence of them when they're a group of these young Jedi. They're communicating with their allies off planet, and I believe the Falcon is at one point hovering over there, but they can't pick up the kids, and they all struggle, and some of them are straggling and being left behind, and Anakin coming forth and reaching that maturity and becoming the beacon of light in that very extreme situation. It just felt so powerful. There's a very touching and sweet moment, a blossoming first love between Anakin Solo and Tahir. Why was it important to include that, knowing that you would kill off Anakin?
Well, again, it's stakes. First of all, you don't ever want to make a death easy. I mean, if you're going to kill a character, you want to do it in a way that's going to be painful.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to make it cheap, And so it was important to show that Anakin was not just this young action hero. It's that he's a kid. There's people who love him and count on him. He's got a future, and really what developing that relationship with Tahiri was all about was, showing that his future is going to be stolen from him.
It's in a way almost like a Romeo and a Juliet story, right?
Yeah.
In a Romeo and Juliet, you have two warring families, but here obviously you have two warring nations, right? The extragalactic Yuzhan Vong and the denizens of this galaxy. And in the midst of this terrible nightmarish war, these two innocent young souls, and once again, it brings it all home.
And it's important to remember there that Anakin isn't the only one who suffered. I mean, think about Tahiri and his brother and sister.
And the aftermath with Han, right?
Yeah.
We see the aftershock of that in the next couple of novels, which gradually, it still shows you that the person is hurting. It's a living, breathing human being. It's not just like, at the end of the book, let's move on to the next one. It's like a serialized TV show. It really translates into the future stories.
Yeah.
Referring still to Anakin, on StarWars.com, you mentioned after being asked Anakin as the character to die over Jacen and Jaina, you answered that people must have been curious about the fact that Anakin was the one who died, but you didn't want to go into many details because of the ramifications it may have for the rest of the series. Are there really that much ramifications that could evolve from the death of Anakin?
Well, yeah, I think that his death is a turning point for every character that even knew him. I mean, think about what it did to Tahiri, what it did to his brother Jacen and his sister Jaina, and his parents.
I gotta tell you, I'm really afraid for Han right now. It's like after Chewbacca, Anakin died, and Chewbacca died first saving Anakin. Now Anakin's dead, so I'm afraid we're gonna find him like drunk in an alley or something. This could be ugly.
Yeah, I guess I can only say no comment.
Okay. Yeah. Is there one Jedi in particular that you really want to kill, to do something?
Well, you must have read some of my comments. I would have to say that Kip Duran is a very lucky man that he has some guardian angels at Lucasfilm and Del Rey. Because I've always Kip for me has always been kind of an irritating character.
Mm.
And I've never, I have to admit that, I like what Elaine did with him, but I still have a hard time understanding why he has such a huge fan base. When I say huge, why there are a lot of people that really like him.
I got to agree with you. He's kind of a little bit of an annoying Jedi.
Yeah. Well, he doesn't learn is the problem with me that I've had with him is that, he goes through and he makes these mistakes, and that's fine. Everybody makes mistakes, and even if it does, involve blowing up a world.
Yeah.
But he never seemed to learn from him. And I think that what I liked about what Elaine did with him was that she had him learn something from his experiences, and he became a much wiser, more interesting character for me in Dark Journey than he had been previously.
In Star by Star, your Borg's fella goes out like a hero. Somewhat, after years of being a sniveling opportunist, what is Lucas Book's ideas to have him gain some sort of a minute redemption in death? Or was that your call?
Well, I had received we had about 1 million emails that go back and forth about the idea for Star by Star and, what was supposed to happen in the story. And in one of those, somebody, and I have no idea who it was, said I would kind of like it if Borsk went out, as something of a hero.
Okay.
That idea just clicked, and so I said, yeah, I think I'll try and do it. And so I wrote it in the outline, and everybody said, oh, wow, what a great idea, what an original idea. And I guess they forgot that it was actually their own idea, even after I told them, hey, this is just what you guys suggested. But, oh, no, we didn't suggest it, so it was somebody there's idea, and I'm not sure who it was.
But you still get the credit for it.
But I'd like to give them credit, but it's just that way that I don't really know whose idea it was, and I just kind of grabbed it and went with it.
What was your first impression when you were introduced to the Yuzhan Vong and their culture?
Interesting, I guess. It's hard because I was contracted to do Star by Star before Vector Prime was out.
Okay.
So I I knew about the Yuzhan Vong, and I kind of had a basic idea of who they were and what they were trying to accomplish before I ever had the privilege of reading about them.
Okay.
But once I was able to read about them, I loved them at the idea stage as well. But once I read about them, I saw that there was an awful lot of richness. That Bob Salvatore did a wonderful job of introducing a very unique and very deadly opponent, or a very unusual opponent that there was a lot of room to play with. And that's what I think was masterful about the Yuzhan Vong, is that the nature of their culture just opened up so many avenues for other writers to explore.
Yeah.
That I thought that was just a great thing to do with the series.
Ragnar Tall, many fans still are iffy about reports of his death. Are we to assume he did in fact die during Star by Star?
Assume nothing.
Assume nothing. As one of my friends used to say, if you assume too much, you make an ass of you and me.
Yes.
We've talked earlier about the huge cast of characters in Star by Star. Any particular ones you enjoyed writing more than others?
I enjoyed writing them all because they're all my children. I loved writing Han and Leia, obviously. Luke was a lot of fun, but he's a very difficult character to write because he's so powerful that you have to be careful to use him in situations where he's called for. Because if he's walking down the street and there's a bunch of muggers picking on somebody, Luke pretty much just blinks and the problem is taken. So he's a difficult character to work with.
Yeah.
I loved writing again. The Barabel Jedi were something that I tried to add and bring to the Star Wars universe, and I loved writing them, and I think that they turned out just as well as I could have hoped.
Yeah, you include them in Recovery, I think.
Yeah, I do. They were so much fun that I wanted to keep writing them.
Star by Star is very dense on action. There's a lot of action sequences. How important was it to balance it out with the story and character development?
Well, one of my pet peeves in watching movies is that there's a certain class of movie where you watch at action movies, and it starts off with a big action scene, and then they think that developing the plot and building it to a climax just consists of more action, right? Until you get to the end where you have people out running fireballs and just ridiculous stuff. And that always feels hollow to me. And so knowing that Star by Star was going to be a book that was just filled with action, I had to really think about what that means. And the way that you build action and give action meaning is that you raise the stakes, right? So that in the first third of a book, this is what I generally do. The first third of a book, there's something at stake that is usually personal. The character is going to lose something if he doesn't achieve something. And then in the second third of the book, the stakes become universal, so that it's something, like his whole community is going to lose something if he doesn't succeed and fix this problem. And then where do you go from there? I mean, it's like, right, the world's going to end if I don't fix this problem. Well, where do you go from there? That's when you go to the spiritual stakes, when the character has to make a decision that is going to define who he is. And that's how you increase the stakes and increase the depth and make a big action scene, make the climax count. If you don't do that, the climax is just, it's just fireballs. But if you do that, and, it can be just the simplest, smallest piece of action, but if the character's whole spirit is at stake and who he is and what kind of person he's going to be or is, then you end up making a really, really important action scene. And the action itself can be something, as simple as one swing of a sword or just the decision to do one violent act or not to do one violent act.
Now, on that same subject, one thing readers will certainly notice, pain is a very common theme in a lot of your books, both Star Wars and non-Star Wars. Did you have a lot of injuries growing up?
Well, not as many as my younger brother. but yeah, I've had a few. I mean, I played football all through high school and through college. I played Division III football for 4 years in college. But then I raced on our high school ski team and was an all-state ski jumper. So I've had my fair share of injuries. I mean, half a dozen concussions and knee injuries and dislocated or broke every finger on my hands, so I've had a little bit of experience.
So have you drawn a lot of that into your stories then when you do injuries to your characters?
The injuries that I've really had have always been things that I consider relatively minor compared to some of the things that happen to the characters in my books. But it does give you an experience, something to draw on in terms of realizing, okay, when you get injured, how do you physically feel? I've had enough of that experience to be able to extrapolate and describe it.
The heroes in your novels often have to go through a lot of pain as they transition through the story. Is there a reason why that is such a strong thematic influence in your stories?
I am a guy who wrote a book called Pages of Pain, so... Yeah, I think that the real reason that there's a lot of pain in my book is because, pain is a teacher. And, on every level. If you think about it, when you growing up and you burn your fingers on a burner or something, I mean, it teaches you that fire is dangerous. And when you make a mistake and give your heart to the wrong person, that teaches you to be a little more cautious and reflective about who you date or choose to fall in love with. And to that extent, I've always kind of regarded pain as really the crucible that people go through before they become old and wise.
When you're writing in the NGO series or in the expanded universe, are you totally free when you're writing in them, or is Lucas Licensing giving you really a tight road that you have to follow?
Actually, you're freer than I thought you were at the beginning. With Star by Star, I had written an outline, and I thought that I had to stick pretty close to that outline because that's what, I had a lot of other writers working before and after me, and for that reason alone, you had to stick close to it. But there were a few places where I would be writing along, and I would have an idea, and I would say, I wonder if I can do that. And I would decide, well, it might be just too far out, and I wouldn't do that idea, and then I would go, continue on with the story. But when I saw how the review process worked during Star by Star, I saw that, the editors and everybody that's involved with that are all very supportive. Mm-hmm. And they never poo-poo an idea just because it's not in an outline or anything. So when I wrote Tattooing Ghost, I felt much freer to just go where I wanted to and try different things. And I knew that, that some of the things I was trying weren't going to work. But I also knew that I couldn't predict which ones were going to work and which ones weren't. And that the worst thing that would happen is somebody would say, well, that one doesn't work, maybe you can do it this way. Uh-huh. And so I felt really free with Tattooing Ghost. And with Star by Star, I didn't really pull any punches. I felt that anything I felt I really needed to try, I went ahead and tried. But there were, some things that were a little bit wilder or a little bit riskier or riskayer,
but
that I didn't do because I thought, well, that won't fly. And now in retrospect, I would have tried them and let them say, that won't. Let them tell me that because they weren't going to be upset with me for trying it.
Yeah, but they seem very open to ideas, I think.
Yeah, they're very open to ideas. That's been my experience. Is that if you're doing something and it works and you have a good solid reason for doing it, they're really open to it.
Did you have any personal feedback or interaction with George Lucas?
No, I didn't have any personal. I never met George or worked with him directly. I suspect that a few of the comments that I got back on some of my outlines and so forth had come from George because everything ran through him at that time. But I wouldn't know what comments were his and what comments were Howard Rothman's or somebody else's. What we were told about the expanded universe was that it was canon until George says it's not. So it was always that George could overrule anything we did, but up to that point, we had to consider it canon, and it was more of an obligation than a reward because it meant that we had to really know the canon that came before us. So, by the time I wrote Star by Star, I think there had been something like 80 novels already out. So I had to know, I didn't have to know them intimately, but I had to know the story and the background and the general plots of all of those and the character arcs for any of the characters that I was going to use who had appeared in those previous novels. So the research was immense, even before I started. And I started as a fan and somebody who had read certainly Timothy Zahn's and Kevin J. Anderson's books. And so I had read probably 25 or 30 of the 80 books, but
Nice.
that left me like 50 books to read. And
I'm still not done with them.
Yeah, it took a lot of work, and remembering all of those details was beyond any human. Fortunately, we had Leland Chi and Pablo Hidalgo, who both were very good at filling in authors on what we didn't know and what we were missing and getting wrong. So without those guys, it would have been an impossible task to even include all of the characters that I did in Star by Star. And I knew, a lot of the characters in Star by Star came from Kevin J. Anderson's Young Jedi Knights series. And I had read those and the books that he had written with Rebecca, the Junior Jedi Knights. But I'd read all those and loved them and thought, oh gosh, and I'm going to be writing about Anakin, so I'm going to be able to bring all of these characters. And I brought all of them in, but I wouldn't have been able to keep them nearly as tight to continuity if it hadn't been for Leland Chi and Pablo.
In an early draft of Star by Star, I had named one of the ships, there was a Mon Mothma, which I understand there's been quite a controversy about the class of it.
Okay.
There was also, its sister ship was named the Admiral Akbar. And I had not intended that I would have killed either one of them by naming a ship after him.
Mm-hmm.
But as it turned out that when you name a ship after a certain character, that character is considered dead because they don't name ships after living characters.
Mm-hmm.
So they let me do it with Mon Mothma. And that's kind of how she ended up being declared dead, was kind of through an accident on my part. And I almost killed Admiral Akbar that way, so I guess I'm just relieved that they didn't let me do that and allowed somebody else to do it.
Yeah. As an author, what are your comments on the expanded universe versus the official stories of the movie? What would you say to fans that deny the expanded universe because it's not written by George Lucas?
Well, my view on the expanded universe is that it's simply an extension of the official George Lucas universe.
Yeah.
And I think that you have to look at it in terms of hierarchies of what do you want to say, legitimacy, or hierarchies of what counts.
Yeah.
And of course, everything in the movies is the first hierarchy. What is said there goes.
Yeah.
And then there's an expanded universe, and of course, George can't possibly write everything that read or play in with the Star Wars universe, so he has to delegate some of that responsibility to other people like myself. And so we write what is, quote, official, but if it conflicts with George's material, I would be the first to say that you should go with George and with what George says. And then, of course, there's a hierarchy below that for other people, contribute unofficially or just for the fun of it.
Yeah, fan fiction and such.
Yeah, fan fiction and such. And to my view, as long as that stuff doesn't conflict with anything that's in the official expanded universe or the movies, as long as it works, it's fine with me. But, everybody, we have to realize that everybody's world is going to be a little bit different because of their take or the things that they're interested in, especially when you get down to the level of the fan fiction, because, there's nobody to coordinate that material.
Would you say that the expanded universe is becoming the Star Wars universe?
I think it's almost a case of parallel universes.
Okay.
So that you have the first universe is George's universe, which is a little bit smaller because there's only really one person or one group of people determining the course of that universe. Whereas the expanded universe has many more people that you can use for resources. And so it is very similar to George's universe, but perhaps has some differences that, some conflicts and differences, which are unavoidable, really, when you have so many people doing so much with it.
I think my final thoughts are that I was incredibly privileged to be a part of a publishing experiment that included a 19-book series. I don't even know how many different authors we have. That was an incredibly bold and risky thing to do for Del Rey. I think it paid off in great, great stories that carried the Star Wars universe in a wonderful direction and in an engaging direction, and one that kept readers engaged.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know. I was just, in the right place at the right time, and I'm really, really lucky to be there.
Thanks a lot, Troy.
Hey, thank you for having me.
No
Have
problem.
a nice day.
I was wondering when we were going to get to read about Kyle Katarn at all.
In Star by Star, Kyle was going to die. But then we found out that LucasArts was making another. This was when Jedi Knight or Jedi Academy was coming out, and so Kyle Katarn, it was last minute, very, very last minute.
They got their governor's reprieve.
So it's not all a part of that Kyle wasn't more involved in the New Jedi Order, just couldn't step on LucasArts' toes.
Basically, after we found out that God wouldn't let you mess with him, we were afraid to touch him.
It does get hard as the EU continues, and for example, the kids get older. It gets harder and harder to focus on so many characters who all become major, and then none of them are at risk because they all become too important. But a little funny thing, it's funny to me, is when we had to kill Anakin, but everybody sat around saying, but Anakin isn't much of a character. Who's going to care? So we made a point of building him up in the books until then. So then he dies, and man, the outcry was like, how could you do this? So I call that success. I think we did it right because we care and we want people to care. No death should be, we shouldn't ever throw away a death. It's not, so you've got to care. So all of a sudden, people are saying, well, you killed off somebody major. Like, that wasn't really major. We didn't think that was major, but we did our job right and we made it an important death. So now it becomes major. So it's hard. It's a balance we have to try to walk.
I wanted to ask quickly, Anakin, it was such a bold move for them to kill Anakin in the series, and it affected me and my brother reading it, and it was, but I felt that it was something that in the end, it caused a lot of change for Jaina and Jason's characters, help them kind of grow in a kind of a sad but very real way. What was your reaction to Anakin's death? Because I think you said you read the books. What did you have a strong reaction to him dying?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult for any reader when a beloved character dies, particularly when he's someone that shows so much promise. Here's a person that could have made a vast difference in the world. And to see that just dissipate is really hard for any reader, I think. There's, in times of history, there was someone who showed enormous potential. A particular area of interest for me is a Prince of England that died at the age of 18, would have been an exceptional ruler. And that always seemed like promise that was just wasted. And Anakin, obviously, was exceptional.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it so real for someone like Jaina or Jason, because now they have to step up to the plate and they don't feel like they're ready.
Yeah, that's daunting.
Yeah. There must be plot points and characters that were introduced in NGO, especially to mislead the readers. Can you name some that were already there? I think Anakin was one.
Yes, Anakin was one. I apologize to all Anakin fans out there. Anakin set that up, and I didn't do it. But don't blame me. But yeah.
But I was fooled by it.
The readers were meant to be led to the conclusion that Anakin was going to be the big hero of this series.
And I thought at the midpoint that he was to be the leader of the New Jedi Order at the end of the series.
Yeah, but he died, and he'll stay that way, so far as I know. His interpretation of the Force was incomplete.
As for Anakin dying, I have to say, I never agreed with that decision. I did not want Anakin to die. I thought there was a lot of other really cool stuff that could have been done with Anakin, which is why in the 2 books that I did, I worked as hard as I did to characterize him and make him into a character that people would like, because I was hoping secretly that that there would be some sort of a positive reaction to him, and that might spare his life. For lots of other stuff that I thought would have been way cool to be able to do with him, but it didn't, and I kind of felt sorry. I think it was Troy Denning who got to kill him off, and I kind of felt sorry for Troy because I knew a lot of people really liked Anakin, and then here Troy had to go and whack him. So sorry about that, Troy.
and what other ideas did you had in mind for Anakin?
Oh, what I would have loved to have done with Anakin is to have him and say, some 20-something-year-old daughter of Lando Calrissian and a couple of other characters, some other Jedi Knight, and, pull together a cast of sort of odd characters and be able to have them in the Millennium Falcon or another ship going out doing little missions and just kind of being a Doom Patrol or, Odd Squad out there doing stuff. I mean, I thought it would have been perfect within what we were talking about, but, the powers that be did not, so out of my hands. I'm not omniscient and I don't go without making mistakes, so, the choices that others made may in fact have made it a superior product to what, what I thought originally would have been. But that's, that is why those guys get paid the big bucks and why, they're the ones who get to plan this stuff.
Was there a fan reaction to Anakin's death? Do you remember? Was there, because Chewbacca had.
Yeah, not like it was with Chewbacca. No, there was no, not like Chewbacca. After that outcry, everything seemed pretty mild,
Yeah.
because people were along for the ride then. And I mean, and it was good because those kind of, sort of like, those sorts of deaths upset people because they no longer know which way the series is going to go, or like anyone's up for grabs now. Anything could happen, and that's always good. That kind of tension.
I can attest to that because when I read that series, of course I was invested, but when it was a double whammy when Anakin and the fall of Coruscant happens, then I remember for the first time in any Star Wars fiction, I don't remember feeling this way in any other book or any other series, thinking to myself, how are they going to get out of this? I mean, I just don't see. You guys had me.
Yeah, I mean, and it works, right? Game of Thrones did that too. It's just like, geez, we don't know who's going to survive this.
Yeah.
What do you think of ebooks? You wrote Recovery and A Forest Apart. What about Recovery?
Well, basically, the process of writing an ebook is not that much different for me than writing any other kind of book. But when we were writing Star by Stars, I was finishing that up, they had come up with the idea of doing an ebook to kind of introduce or lead readers into the hardcovers and to use them as kind of an invitation to come and see the hardcover.
Mm-hmm.
And then they could also use them as a bonus to be put out into the paperbacks, I suppose.
Yeah.
And she said, would you like to write one of these? And I said, sure, that'd be great fun. And at that, for Recovery, I think that they had already had the idea of writing the story of Leia coming to terms with her wounds, and dealing with the reconciliation that goes on after Balance Point. And so that idea, they said, would you like to write this story where Han and Leia have a little more time to reconcile than they had available during the fall of Duro, and also to deal with her legs healing, because after Balance Point there was a little period of time where she showed up and then her legs were once again healed.
Recovery and Tatooine Ghost are both stories based mostly on Han and Leia. You seem to have a bond with them and you write them very well. Do you inspire or base their relationship on yours or something like that?
You're the first person to ask me that question, and the honest truth is, to quite a bit of extent, I do.
Okay.
I think that I don't see myself as being quite the scoundrel that hunts, but I do see.
Maybe your wife does.
But there's a lot of Leia in my wife, and I'll find myself kind of thinking about her in terms of how Han would react and so forth, and using that as a resource to write, which is maybe not fair. I don't know.
Is she a big Star Wars fan like you?
She's a Star Wars fan for sure. I don't know, if you would say she's as big a fan as I am, but probably pretty close, and she might even be a bigger fan in some aspects. She really loves Han and Leia as well. She enjoys having me work on the Star Wars. And I must say adds quite a bit to the stories in terms of her comments and her insights, when I ask her, what would you do in a case like this? If you were Leia, what would you do? And invariably, the answer is about 3/4 of the way away from what I had been expecting.
Here to speak with us today is Elaine Cunningham. So, what got you into writing?
Well, I started out, I was a musician, a music teacher, and I was going to school for an MBA at the time. It was the 80s. That's the sort of thing people did. And my first son was born, and the idea of going back to work and putting him in daycare was just heartbreaking. And I wanted to figure out something I could do to stay home with my son. And my husband said, "You're always reading. Why don't you try writing something?" And I thought, well, that's a pretty good idea. So at the time, women's fiction was very popular, very hot, and it was expanding rapidly. And so I thought, well, I'll give it a shot. I wasn't a big reader of women's fiction, and that I learned a very important lesson then. You should write what you read. You should write what you enjoy, because I didn't get it. The writers who were very popular, I didn't care for. And my husband's aunt, who's a dear friend of mine, was a big fan of romance novels. And she would read my attempts. I wrote 3 or 4 full manuscripts, and they were, technically okay, but I just didn't really get it. And she read the last one, and she goes, "Girl, you don't have a romantic bone in your body. Let's face it, you're weird. You should be writing something like, I don't know, science fiction or fantasy." And that felt right.
You've written 1 full Star Wars novel, Dark Journey, and 3 short stories, focusing a lot on Jaina Solo and Jag Fell, which are pretty big fan favorites. What about these 2 characters drew your attention, and how were you able to delve so deep into their heads? Was that your prerogative, or did they give you some direction to do so?
I didn't choose Jaina. Jaina was, I was the writer chosen to tell this particular part of her story. See, the New Jedi Order was a huge story arc. I knew what the story arc was. There was a story Bible, so we had an overall sense of what was happening. And of course, I read all the other books previous to Dark Journey in manuscript, in outline, and then when they were finished. And Jaina's story, Dark Journey, was a small moment in time, a breather between 2 very large, significant events. And they wanted a female writer to take on this story. And basically, going back to Bob Salvatore, he recommended me to Shelley. And because I'd written other female characters, and he thought I'd be a good match for this at this time. So yeah, I was matched to Jaina. And it worked out really well because I love the character. I love that she's her father's daughter. She's a powerful Jedi, and yet at heart, she's a bit of a rogue. And I like that. And to get into her head, what I did was quite literally read every book in which she appeared. Every single one of them, all of them. And I loved her depiction in the Jedi Apprentices. That she made sense to me. She was a spunky, take charge character. I liked her.
Writing a book that was wedged in the middle of this series between 2 of the longer arcs, was it hard to be able to write this story that had so much happening just before and so much happening just after?
Very, very hard. Because for one thing, all stories have highs and lows. And when you're dealing with a story that's told in 21 novels, you're going to have some lower notes. And I knew that this novel was a time for people to regroup, to take stock, to kind of, and yet it had to have its own story arc. So writing a small story was hard to make it feel like it had weight and importance of its own. Also, Jaina was absolutely shattered in this book. She was the take charge gal. She was the person who was always in control, and she completely lost control. In the book just before this one, when she and her fellow Jedi were captured and tortured, she was the first one to break. It shattered her self-concept. She lost her younger brother. She saw that as a personal failure. Jaina didn't know who she was when Dark Journey started. And she wasn't so much tempted by the dark side as she was just trying to figure out, rethink things she always thought to be true about herself and just didn't seem to fit anymore. And then everybody was stunned. Everybody was dealing with grief because of the loss of Anakin. So those things were difficult to work with. And also Jaina, whose strength was in the people around her, felt all of a sudden she was very isolated because the way she was reacting, she was pushing people away from her. And she was making decisions that she otherwise would never have made, doing things that she otherwise wouldn't have done. So that was a hard balance to find. I felt like I got to know Jaina very well, but I had to write to her about a time when she wasn't really herself. So trying to get that level of, to express both those things was a real challenge.
So you captured trauma really well, at least the mental aspect of it. I work in a mental hospital, and I get to see trauma on people all the time. Yep. Where did you draw from to be able to capture that emotion? Where does someone draw from without, if they don't have personal experience, to capture that type of feeling, that emotion, that sense of despair, yet strength to move forward? Where does that come from?
That's a good question. I wish I had a good answer for it. I don't know. I think we all have that knowledge. We just have to find it, find the words to shape it in. I can't really express it any more than that. We have an imagination, we have empathy, we have human experience. We just have to extrapolate and find a way to make it real, and then to try to make it understood.
When it comes to writing strong female characters like Jaina, like Hapens, like some of your Forgotten Realms characters, what is the secret to getting inside one's head and writing a strong female character without being accused of writing a Mary Sue or writing someone deemed weak or offensive to readers? How is that balance found in your writing?
Well, I'm glad you think I pulled it off. Not everyone agrees, especially in the early years when there weren't that many female characters. And it was... At first, it was a bit of a trial for people to try to get the idea of a female warrior. And then there was Buffy, and then there was Xena, and then, it began to enter people's psyche a little more that, yeah, this can work. And I think it's key to creating strong characters of either gender, to put them up against stronger opponents. When a character is struggling against overwhelming odds, they have to be strong, or else they're going to be roadkill. And if a character is struggling, having setbacks, having failures, they're less likely to be perceived as Mary Sues. They're not perfect. They're not all powerful. Not everybody loves them. They're struggling. And struggle is story, so that works out well, I think.
Okay. So one more addition to this one. Yep. From a listener, it says, as a female author who writes strong female characters, is writing a strong character good enough, or is there a difference between writing strong men and strong women?
I think there's a difference in how they're perceived. I don't think there should be a difference in how they're written. I don't know if I can qualify that in any particular way. I mean, a strong character is a strong character. Somebody with skill in magic is a skilled wizard. Somebody that is skilled with the sword is a good fighter. Someone who sticks to their principles has a strong character. I mean, I rate them the same.
Okay.
And in terms of backstory, I do do quite a bit of work actually on developing a character before I start writing. I do a detailed character outline. I also do a detailed story arc for each character. So I know where the character's going. What is the major decisions they have to make? What is the basically plot is 3 questions. What does this person want? What do they do to get it? What stands in their way? And you keep asking that question over and over until you have a plot. I always think about their background. what would they face? How would that shape them? What would they rebel against? What challenges would they find? It's basically like taking a character sheet and filling it out, except you do it in a lot deeper detail.
Jag Fell was a bit of a stretch. To be honest, my first reaction to him was negative. And when I was told that he was being considered as a possible love interest for Jaina, I was a little bit appalled. And so, but that's what the situation was. So I had to find a way to make it work. And I had to figure out what made Jag tick. And writing the story Red Sky Blue Flame was part of that process, how he became who he was. And then trying to figure out what he and Jaina, what drew them together. What made sense to me was looking back to the origins of Han and Leia's relationship, kind of gender swap them. You have your scruffy pilot and you have this very self-possessed aristocrat. And there's an attraction between Han and Leia, and I used that to kind of find the seeds for the attraction between Jag and Jaina. But yeah, Jag was hard for me. I had to really work to try to get it, understand where he was coming from.
So this person's a huge fan of Jag and Kip Durand, and so he sent me a question just like 10 minutes ago. It says there's a striking difference between Jag Fell and a fundamentally nice person who believes in totalitarianism, and Kip Durand, who compromises ethically but definitely opposes fascism. Both are fleshed out characters, and both are good guys despite believing in the opposite to one another. Why aren't there more characters like these in books in general?
I'm not really sure that there aren't. There are a lot of complicated characters. People who hold views that they believe in and that sometimes have slightly gray ways of going about achieving them. But I think that's a very astute estimation of Jag and Kip. I don't think I can improve upon how the reader phrased this question. I wish that there were more characters like them. Kip, particularly, he was a lot of fun. He had such a dark past and such a checkered reputation at the time. And yet Jaina learned a great deal from him. He came into her life at a good time.
And again, you captured someone who has dealt with trauma, but is further down the road from the trauma pretty well when you wrote Kip. And I think a lot of the authors have hit him pretty well since Anderson created him in the mid-90s.
Long time ago, yeah.
A lot of fans talk about like the Jaina and Jag and Jaina and Kip thing. Do you have any comments on what it was like to write sort of that complicated thing in Jaina's this part of her life?
Yeah, she wasn't really at a good point in her life to start a relationship. There's times when you really just shouldn't. And I was told that she needed to get Jag Fell into her life. And she didn't do a real good job of it in the book because I didn't feel it would be realistic for that relationship to develop so soon and at that point. They really were quite different too. So it took some work to try to find points of reference, places where they could genuinely connect later on down the line. Her relationship with Kip was really complicated because he was a mentor and they had a long history and he had some really dark spots in his life. And I think that was resonating with her at that time because she was in a pretty dark place.
Yeah, and the way that you wrote Kip, coming from that darkness and learning some things, and even being kind of a borderline character himself, I've heard from so many people that it was really your characterization of Kip they liked.
Well, that's good to hear. He, again, very complicated character. I think people that go through some of the things he did, made the magnitude of mistakes he made, are going to look at life with a lot more nuance and perhaps a lot more compassion than people who have always followed the path, done the right thing, never made any devastating mistakes. He has messed up so much that I think he was more than capable of dealing with what Jaina was going through and perhaps understood her better. And I think she knew that. She didn't feel like herself at that time. She didn't know who she was or how to move forward. And he'd been there. So,
right. Yeah.
And you can sense when someone gets you, and he did.
Yeah, and they do have that kind of unspoken understanding.
When people ask sometimes for writing tips, one of the things I will suggest is imagine where they live. Take a good look at their environment. What do they have? How do they arrange their things, etc.? And if that seems like a stretch just now, imagine that they walk into your house. And what do they see? What do they notice? That's a great writing technique, is to bring your characters into your space. What do they notice? What people see tells you what their preoccupations are.
You said you can tell a lot about someone, about how they react to your space if they were to just walk in. And I was just wondering how you would conceptualize that for the characters of Dark Journey, like Jaina, Jag, and Kip. How would they react if they were to walk into your space?
Well, they're all warriors, so I think the first thing they do is assess the situation for possible threats. It wouldn't take them more than a minute to realize there aren't any. There's no weapons, no droids, no animal guardians, and Kip and Jaina would know right away that I'm not a Force user. So after that first impression was out of the way, I think they would notice a technology gap. I mean, they drive around in a hyperdrive, I schlep around in a Prius. It would be similar to you or me getting dropped in the middle of 16th century England. I think they'd react differently, though, than you and I would, because they routinely travel to other worlds, and they're accustomed to encountering primitive cultures. But my space would probably qualify as another one of those primitive cultures. I think the only detail that's likely to catch your attention would be the wall of books, because that's very old technology, and from what I've seen, books seem to be fairly rare. So their first impression would probably be along the lines of, ooh, the wisdom of the ancients. And then they'd wonder how I would come to possess so much of it.
That's interesting, and I think that's interesting as a tool for how it could help, imagine that.
It can
character's
be.
world.
Yeah, it can be. I have read many times that a good way to get to know a character is to envision their space. What type of equipment do they have? How do they live? What does their space look like? And that, I found, it's easier to do, to flip that, particularly with people that aren't used to thinking in terms of character development. Say, okay, if this person came in, what would they notice? Because you can tell a lot about a person by what they notice.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you take Jaina for a more messy or more clean kind of girl?
I think she would be very methodical and very tidy. And the character in particularly the Young Jedi Knights was very disciplined.
Yeah, I've always liked that about her character. She's very much a no-nonsense kind of character. She carves out her own part of that world distinctly.
I think that's one of the things that made Dark Journey difficult to write, was that Jaina was always in control, very self-possessed, and usually a leader. And in the book previously, when she and her friends were all captured and tortured, she was the first one to break. And I think this really shook her sense of who she was. And so in Dark Journey, she was not only dealing with the death of her brother, she was having a paradigm shift about her own self-perception. So that's one of the things that I took into the writing of that story.
What was it like for you to write the main three from the film, Luke Skywalker and all of that? Was that challenging? Was that interesting?
It's a big challenge, because you want to be consistent to the vision, but you don't want to repeat things that were done. But it was daunting. I think Luke Skywalker is the hardest person to write about. Han, I understand a little better. I felt like the banter between Han and Leia, which is very, very minimal in the book, was one of the most fun things to write, because we saw so much of their relationship. And so I had a sense of that and could kind of go with that particular tone.
I like dialogue. It's difficult to write, and it doesn't come easily to me. I have to go over it and over it and over it until it sounds like it's effortless. But when it clicks, it's so much fun to do. Particularly if there's a bit of humor in it. That's what I really enjoy writing. And it's fun when the dialogue really tells you who the character are. And that's moments that I really enjoy.
And Leia has always been one of my favorite characters. She's
Yeah,
one of the people that knew exactly who she was, what she wanted, and what her values and goals were from the time she was very young. Very few people are like that.
Yeah, that's something that I think she almost has in common with Tenno Cobb, which you brought in with this book, which she's another interesting character that is very much focused in that way.
Hmm. Well, that's good and it's not good, because it's hard to give Leia a character arc, because she is who she is and she remains who she is. And there's not a whole lot of change there, not a whole lot of moments where she becomes and changes and grows, because she started out at such a good place right from the beginning and pretty much just keeps that up. I mean, there's things throughout the whole series. She and Han have rough spots. She went through a great deal of heartache, but she was still Leia. She particularly didn't change. So yeah, I love the character, but that really does add a challenge.
Yeah, I think it would be. I mean, I've heard that from many authors that it's exciting, but it's quite a bit intimidating, I think, as well. I mean, it would be.
It is. These are icons of pop culture.
To me, it's part of my philosophy. Writing in a shared world is like writing historical fiction. I'm a history geek. I used to teach history. I like doing research, and the social history is what makes a story. It's not what makes a story come alive. The characters do that, but it's the skeleton. It's the structure. If you don't have that, the story doesn't feel real to me. So I do approach very strongly from a social history aspect. And also folklore has been a lifelong interest to me. And so folklore is what drew me to fantasy in the first place, actually. So that's a big influence.
I read a lot of folklore from all over the world. I've been fascinated with that since I was a little kid, and probably that's what drew me to fantasy more than anything. Because Marion Zimmer Bradley, who wrote The Mists of Avalon, the Dark River novels, etc., she said something once that made a great deal of sense to me. She said early in her career, she's given the advice, if you want to write science fiction, study science. If you want to write fantasy, study religion. And I'm defining religion in the broad sense of all mythology from all over the world, and obviously some of that has to be translated. So yeah.
I wanted to bring this up. It was very fascinating to me. You talked about your interest in history and mythology and folklore and even studying religion, world religion. And, you also wrote, obviously, for the series, the Yushin Vong, which was such a unique species and people. How was it like for you to write that species and that people? What was your vision when writing them, or how did you get into that headspace?
Well, everyone has a way of looking at the world, and because I do have an interest in folklore, mythology, and so forth, I tended to focus on their preoccupation with superstitions, prophecies, etc. So that shaped the plot direction quite a bit. And I also think it shaped their perceptions and their decisions. So I felt that was a key element. Other than that, there was a huge sadistic streak. But when it came right down to it, I viewed the Yushin Vong as basically Klingons on steroids. They were a warrior nation. They were very distinct, very xenophobic. They didn't particularly like anybody else. And there's some similarities there.
All the influence of those things, studying politics, world history. I was just wondering if that came in when you're conceiving of the Hapens, because you wrote a lot about the Hapen society. What were you drawing on, or what was your vision when writing them?
Well, I've got to admit that everything you saw in Dark Journey in terms of the Hapen culture was largely based on previous Star Wars novels, supplements, and so forth. My approach to writing any story set in a shared world setting is very similar to if I were writing historical fiction. The history exists. You can't ignore it. The fact that it's all fictitious is really beside the point. A story has to fit the culture. You can't make mistakes in terms of details, and you have to try to capture the tone. So that's how I approach any story that has an existing history and culture. I did explore some aspects of it just a little more. For example, how the men in that culture felt about their secondary roles and how they might have dealt with some of those limitations. I also tried to add another layer to kind of cause aversion to this culture. She always wanted to take a very different path, and she ended up doing the very thing she really, really didn't want to do. And I felt that said a lot about her sense of duty and who she was at her core. It wasn't a very nice thing to do to her, but it seemed like a logical thing in terms of her character.
What is your writing ritual like? This is from Two Hand. Do you prefer silence, maybe some background music, coffee?
I can't listen to music while I'm writing. Years and years ago, I was taking a grammar class just for the hell of it, And the teacher was talking about how trained musicians have a hard time generally carrying on a conversation when music is playing because we are trained to actively listen. And it is literally like trying to carry on two conversations at once because you're using the same neurological pathways for listening to music and carrying on a conversation. And writing is very conversational. So I can't do both. I can't have background music because I have to actively listen to it.
What do you feel about the advent of audiobooks and their potential influence on the novel experience?
I think it has a rather large influence because you can write for the mind's ear, how something hears in your, how something sounds in your head, but until you hear it written, spoken aloud, it's a very different experience. One of the pieces of advice that's often given to beginning writers is to read your work aloud, or better yet, have someone else read aloud, because you hear it much differently. And another thing is you pace differently when you hear them read. So it is just a different experience.
These days, the series is getting a lot of positive appraisal. Do you have any feeling about that, looking back at your work on the series?
I think one of the things that was difficult about writing Dark Journey is that every story has certain beats. There's moments of like Dark Night of the Soul type of when everything's going wrong. There's a midpoint where a major decision is made. And sometimes there's quiet moments where people have to come to terms with something that happened, to reflect and to, figure out what's next. And to have a whole novel that's on that particular beat was tough. I think that it was a very small part of a larger story. There's 21 book story arc. So to tell a complete story within the sense that your function is to deal with this particular moment in time in a larger story was a real challenge. But I was always mindful of the fact that I had the opportunity to be part of what is a pop cultural phenomenon. And I've been very grateful for that.
Well, it's been wonderful speaking with you again. Thank you so much for this.
Well, thank you.
You actually got to write a handful. I mean, you wrote, in addition to Dark Journey, I know you wrote The Apprentice, and then you also wrote Red Sky, Blue Flame, and The Crystal, both of which take place before NJO. I really quite liked The Crystal, actually. How did those short stories come about?
Well, all those stories focused on little gaps in the characters' lives. Nothing that was terribly affecting their character arc, but just looking at a little backstory, maybe a closer look at some of their relationships, what their earlier life was. And they're not difficult to write because once you get a lot of time getting to know a character, like all the Young Jedi Knight novels, to get a character, really a good handle on Jaina's personality and her experiences before the war. So it's not that difficult to focus on a smaller story within that whole big framework of these characters.
I did like that there was just a little bit of dialogue where Jaina is talking to Jacen in The Crystal. Even by that point, Jacen was kind of an introspective person in the Young Jedi Knights books, but more so in New Jedi Order. And I love that there was that little line where Jaina is kind of, I think, teasing Jacen a little bit for that transition where he's kind of becoming a bit more withdrawn and a bit more self-reflective because I think she kind of teases him for being a philosopher suddenly, which I like that little line that you had written in there.
Well, the interplay between brother and sister can take some interesting twists.
Yeah.
And I think as somebody you know very well, a sibling, in this case a twin, starts to change, that's always going to be something that's noticed and commented upon. So that felt real.
Yeah, that was really well done.
Is short form harder or easier to write for you than novels?
Short form is different than writing novels. I don't know if it's easier or more difficult. It's just very, very different. In a short story, everything has to be very concise, very considered. It's just only a little less concise than poetry. You've got a lot to depict in a very short time. Sometimes a short story takes a tremendous amount of work to do for the amount of what actually ends up on a page. But I like them both.
This week, we are interviewing author Aaron Alston. How did you come to work on the X-Wing series?
I've known Mike Stackpole for a long time. We began corresponding a little bit around 1980, 1981 when he was an aspiring fiction writer. And Michael and I had fairly similar sensibilities. We both grew up with an appreciation of the hero pulps like Doc Savage and the Avenger, and writers of the era, Robert E. Howard, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and so forth, as well as a lot of other source materials that feeds into modern science fiction and fantasy. He got the assignment to do the first 4 X-Wing novels based in part on his fiction experience and on his game experience. He wrote the first 4. They were quite successful. Bantam Books asked him to do a book called I, Jedi, which was the continuing adventures of Corran Horn, which would be released in hardback. So he was working on I, Jedi when they came to him and said, actually, I'd also like you to do 4 more X-Wing novels. And he was quite happy about that, but did not have the time to do all 4 because he was working on I, Jedi. It was a major project. They asked for a short list of writers he recommended, and he did give them one, including my name. And they decided at that time that I would be a good match for the series and a good match for Mike's style. And Mike's advice was pretty succinct. He said, well, there's this villain, Warlord Zinj, who needs taking care of. You should start a new X-Wing squadron, give it a cool name, and make the novels funny. The fans like that. That was pretty much the entirety of his advice, and you can see how it is reflected, in fact, in the Wraith Squadron trilogy.
So, Aaron, Wedge Antilles, if I talk to someone on the street, the casual fan, they're going to give me a puzzled response at best. So, who is Wedge Antilles? Who's Wraith Squadron? And what roles have they played so far in the Star Wars saga?
Well, Wedge Antilles is a pilot from the original trilogy of movies. He was in A New Hope. He was on the trench run with Luke and was saved by Luke. He was one of the pilots who went into the second Death Star and blew it up from its side. He was basically an example of the normal guy done good in the Star Wars universe. No Jedi powers, no Force ability, but a brave pilot, dedicated man doing his job. And starting in the mid-1990s, Michael A. Stackpole, a colleague of mine, was given the assignment to do a series of novels about him and pilots in the Star Wars universe. He did 4 of those novels. I kind of inherited the series for 3. Mike did another one, I did another one, and that series was done. That was the X-Wing series. And my 3 novels were the Wraith Squadron trilogy, which was about a commando pilot unit, a specialized operations unit put together by Wedge Antilles for specialized missions. So they had several adventures back in the Bantam era of publication, kind of in the early days of the New Republic, and then their adventures were done.
Urza, just wanted to quickly ask, have you read Vector Prime yet? And what did you think? Did you like it?
Overall, I enjoyed it.
I read that with Vector Prime in the first Jedi Order book, they wanted to kill Luke to kind of say all bets were off. And Lucas himself said, no, you can't kill Luke. And then they went back and said, well, let's kill the family dog. Let's kill Chewbacca.
Del Rey chose Chewbacca, or Del Rey and the writers they were working with chose Chewbacca because he was the character who, whose death would affect everybody, but also would affect the characters in such a way that it would open up all sorts of interesting subplots and ramifications. I mean, in killing Chewbacca, they were able to put Han Solo through an incredible meat grinder that would not have been necessarily the case with anybody else, but say, Leia. But I can't tell you who was on the protected list and who's not because I don't know.
Oh, okay. Well, with New Jedi Order, were all the authors in place when they started that, or it kind of seemed to me that they didn't know exactly who was going to be writing. They had kind of the mainstays, but then for some of the paperbacks that supplemented that, they didn't know at the very beginning who all the authors were, and some had to be brought up to speed.
That's exactly correct. In fact, I was one of the ones who was added after the series started, and that is in large part something I owe to the fans because they were asking for me, and Del Rey said, "Oh, okay, sure." But yeah, not everybody was in place at the start of New Jedi Order. New Jedi Order was a very sprawling series, as befits something that is that is intrinsically a gigantic war.
With my New Jedi Order novels, basically the description that I was given of what I was supposed to do at my point in the series, and I didn't even attend the New Jedi Order authors meetings because I came in so late, was had to do with the Rebel Alliance or the New Republic beginning to turn the tide against the Yuuzhan Vong invasion. It was almost that little detail, like 2 sentences worth of information I was given, and so I got to come up with a notion of having the world of Borleas be kind of a paradigm for the American holdout at Bastogne, which was really the inspiration for those 2 novels. Almost all the details of those 2 novels originated with me.
With NJO, we were all learning the skills of handling this kind of bizarre collaborative process, taking storyline handoffs from one another and setting them off to hand off to the next guy, for example. These skills of communication, vast numbers of emails being generated, that sort of thing, predicting what the effects of our choices are going to make on the next writer down the line, coping with changes that were being handed to us as the direction of the series, shifted and wobbled and altered across time. These were all very new to us with New Jedi Order, and we had to learn them for the first time.
I was wondering on the collaboration side, could you expound a little bit on how collaboration goes with some of the other authors in the Star Wars universe, especially in the extended universe when it comes to sort of, do you maintain a sense of sort of propriety of some of these characters as they get used by other authors, like later down the line, like when Wedge is, now a general and things like that, further down the line?
The answer is yes and no. It's really not all that simple. There has been a substantial effort for the writers to cooperate and collaborate, and this usually manifests itself in a couple of different ways. When a series is being set up, there is what is referred to as a story conference, meaning that a few of us get a free short vacation at one of the Skywalker facilities in California, where we get together and we hash out some of the details of the upcoming series. I was not involved in the one for New Jedi Order. And then at midway points through the series, there tend to be other gatherings at other conventions or sites. We've done them at San Diego Comic-Con, especially in Celebration. Writers get together with Lucasfilm staff, with Del Rey staff, valuable resources like James Lucino, who is a walking, talking encyclopedia of Star Wars. But in the long stretches of time in between those, the writers and the principal editors and continuity people who are involved with the series exchange massive amounts of email. The phone won't handle it anymore, and the internet has grown beyond the smoke signals that were being used by Mike and Tim back in the day. And so we'd have exchanges of emails that might be 100 messages back and forth in the course of a day, as we hash out minute or major plot points. We after the first story conference, we go to our respective corners and hammer out some outlines, exchange those, and send them to Lucasfilm and Del Rey for approval, and then get to the process of writing, and then exchange massive amounts of email to make sure that the details are coherent and we're not treading too heavily on one another's characters.
Writing in military science fiction, do you all use real-world military influences? Do you look at a certain character and try to compare them to a general, an admiral, or are they just completely drawn out of experience outside of real-world history?
I never based any of my military characters on real-world military personalities, but I will say that a couple of the battles in my novels were inspired, at least in part, by real-world battles of World War II, especially. The big carrier fight in Solo Command was inspired by the kind of fog of war situation at the Battle of Midway. It doesn't follow the pattern of the Battle of Midway, but some of the circumstances are similar and follow that pattern. The siege of Borleas in the New Jedi Order novels I did was inspired by Bastogne. And in fact, in the early outline, I referred to the planet as Bastogne, knowing that was just a placeholder. And to a very, very lesser extent, Wedge Antilles on Adumar in Starfighters of Adumar was inspired by the notion of Chuck Yeager flying missions still during the Vietnam War, which was crazy, but he did because he was Chuck Yeager. So that's the kind of limited connection that you'll find in my books.
What do you like most about Wedge, and why is he such an appealing character to fans that they keep wanting more?
Well, I'm not sure why necessarily Wedge has become the fan favorite he has, but I'll let you know what, where my touchstone is for him. I come out of a family with a lot of military members. My uncles were both Vietnam veterans, one in the Marine Corps and one in military intelligence, Army intelligence. And they were loyal military men, but they were a little unusual and kind of differed from the stereotype of military men. They, did their duty, they obeyed their orders, and then after everything was said and done, it was time to sack out for the night, they would subject what they had been through to their own ethical criteria, to ask themselves, did I do the right thing? Next time, will I do it this way? Is this in fact what I should be doing? And so I came to the realization that there were a lot of military men and women out there who were, intellectual military men. They did their duty, and then they subjected everything they'd done to the razor of their own considerations, their own ethics. And so I kind of based my interpretation of Wedge Antilles around that. He does the job, he gets the job done, but he's always thinking about, is this the best way to do it? Is this the best way to answer all the criteria, not only of the armed forces, but of principles of right and wrong. So he is an ethical razor who is always shaving every problem that comes to him by those criteria. And in almost every novel which I've written in which Wedge appears, there is that ethical consideration where he has to decide on the best course, which may not be the most military course. It certainly won't be the most non-military course. It will be the Wedge Antilles course. And if it doesn't turn out to be right, he'll take the beating for it. But he's trying to make the galaxy far, far away better for everybody. Otherwise, he would not be doing what he's doing. And I think a lot of people, a lot of fans resonate with that perspective.
What do you think has made the Wraiths so popular with fans?
I think a lot of the fans believe that everybody who is willing to take the risk and put in the training and go to the effort should be able to contribute to the benefit of the galaxy far, far away, meaning that you don't have to be a Jedi, you don't have to be a superhero. The Wraiths, the Rogues, are by and large not Jedi. They are not Sith. They're not Force users. They are normal people who push themselves into accomplishing extraordinary things. And so that does connect with a lot of readers who know, I would never be lucky enough to have the powers of a son of Krypton. So what could I do instead? And it might be this. And so they connect with that.
Well, part of it is that they aren't misfits. They're characters who have, substantial abilities and intelligence, but really haven't fit in elsewhere in their professional careers, and brought together with a unified purpose and an ability to shine in kind of a non-traditional paramilitary atmosphere. They do. They go out and they kick ass, basically. And a lot of the readers respond to them because, first, they're not superheroes. They're men and women who are dedicated to their purpose, but don't have force power. So they kind of represent the common man in the Star Wars universe. A lot of people like to see that.
Piggy or Wart, he's a Gamorrean. When you were writing him, you probably knew he was going to be a fan favorite. When I was growing up, I used to call them the Pig Guards, but that's not a nice coinage, but there's so much more to this character. He's unlike any of these Gamorrean characters we've seen before, right?
Pretty much. I mean, he was genetically modified as a pup, basically, to have genius-level intelligence, which is mostly expressed in mathematical ability. But he's a great organizer. But he's capable of high-order rational thought and mathematical thought, and consequently, he is definitely a misfit both in his own society of origin and in the normal Star Wars society, because there is, in fact, nothing like him. So what I did when I created him back in the original Wraith Squadron days was to put together a character who is a counter-cliche. I mean, we've all seen the character who is a disaffected loner. Well, I created a character who is a loner but not disaffected, not embittered, just coping with his unique qualities and trying to get by. And that's what Piggy was.
To a certain extent, I based him on myself. Because to a certain extent, I am an outsider. I grew up somewhat insufficiently socialized, which I try to hide as much as possible, especially at conventions when dealing with real people. But most social situations are very awkward for me, and they become less awkward when they are ritualized in some fashion. Like convention panels are ritualized. I have a role to play up on the panel, and this kind of thinking went into the creation and the writing portrayal of Piggy.
Wes Janson was one of my favorites because he is the creature of the id. You know, he is a someone who can flip between someone who is a deadly killer, which he is, and a 5-year-old, which he is. You know, someone who lives in the moment and says pretty much precisely what comes out of his head, goes right out of his mouth, and there is a certain amount of charm to that.
You're able to balance humor with action. A lot of people can't do that. It's very difficult to avoid spoofing or becoming too much of a comedy. So talk about that. How difficult was that, or is that something that just comes naturally for you?
Well, that is actually pretty easy for me, simply because I make a distinction in my own mind between humor and comedy. Wraith Squadron novels, they're not comedy.
Right.
They are action-adventure novels with a heavy dose of humor. Comedy is kind of a genre unto itself. It sets its own rules. It's kind of an environment where people can, take a high fall out of a tall building and they'll land in a big pile of manure because people think that's funny, but it's not something that happens in the real world or a realistic world. That's comedy. Humor is people who are under stress saying things that tend to crack the audience up. Even though the characters are experiencing that stress, the stress is not diminished by what they're saying. It's just a natural reaction. Some of the humor derives from very human responses to bizarre things they encounter. In any wartime environment, any strange, grandiose plan environment, there are going to be things that you see that crack you up. It's inevitable when you're dealing with intelligent beings who are behaving oddly, but it's not comedy. It's simply humor.
Yeah, I've been most pleased, I think, demonstrating that even within the main line of the Star Wars universe, which has a specific tone, which most of the books and most of the comics should in general adhere to, there is room out there for deviations from the genre that is Star Wars. Stuff like Matt Stover and his very, very hard-nosed, painful, and fascinating novels in the Star Wars universe, or Wraith Squadron, which has a bump of humor above that of most of the Star Wars material, demonstrating that there is room for things that are a little out of the normal. Since I'm always been kind of an outsider, it's been nice to wave the flag and have other outsiders in the readership come and flock around and say, yeah, we want more of this too. Not exclusive of the other, but in addition to the other.
You've written Jedi characters who are a little more normal, like Tyria Sarkin to Luke Skywalker, who are extraordinarily powerful. How do you approach writing these Force-sensitive characters?
Well, there are a lot of things you have to do with it, or I feel that I have to do with a Jedi, and one is to understand the physiological relationship between the characters and the Force. You'll see in some early Star Wars fiction, a writer say, so and so used the Force to do this, and for me, that's not a description of what's going on in the mind and the body of that Jedi character. A use of the Force will have physical manifestations, sensations, effects on their energy, effects on their bodies, and this is a major component of how they perceive the universe. And so I always want to have that as a kind of connecting thing. Not everybody knows what it's like to pick up an X-Wing fighter telekinetically, but everyone is aware of what it's like to have physical sensations. And if you tie those two sort of events together, then you have a greater audience understanding of what's going on. Also with the Jedi, there is the question on the power level, there is the question of every person, has a sense of what his own role is. Oftentimes that sense is incorrect. When someone has an overblown or grandiose impression of what his own abilities are. But let's say you're someone like Tyria Sarkin. She knows she's a mid-level Jedi. She knows she will probably never become a Jedi Master, but she has these gifts to offer, and she has motivation. She goes out and does her thing. And if she is still only the person chosen for the team halfway through the choosing process, or toward the end of the choosing process, she knows she can contribute. So the question is this character going to be able to deal with this on an egotistical basis? Do they have to be chosen first, or is it enough to do what they're good at and make things better for other people? And so characters like Tyria, they are, second rank. I won't say second rate, but second rank, power Jedi, but they have a job to do, and they have accepted the duty of doing it. And so, once again, I think readers connect with that.
I've been trying to figure out the Tanner family situation, just sort of their marriage.
Here's the situation with that, and I want you to understand that this is based on historical precedent. When you have a country that is being torn apart by internal war, or being invaded and destroyed by external war, it is not uncommon for a family to basically tear itself into small chunks and send them in separate directions so that somebody will survive. And this was the kind of horrible pragmatic decision that Kel and Tyria made at the height of the Yuuzhan Vong War. What they did was they went in their separate directions, hoping that some of them would survive. The directions they went, Kel stayed with Wraith Squadron, knowing that being, with intelligence would give him information that could perhaps help other members of his family survive. He might have to violate a sacred oath or a sacred duty, but he would be in a position to get information that could help the others survive. Tyria went on the road with Duran, first so that she could continue training herself as a Jedi, and so that she could help train him as a Jedi in areas that were more remote from the Yuuzhan Vong War, and therefore increase the chance that the son would survive, because he would have a less likely opportunity to come in direct conflict with the Yuuzhan Vong. Jesmyn was sent back to Toparawa to be raised by cousins, close relatives, but not immediate family relatives of Tyria's, which meant that we had yet another member of the family who might survive if Toparawa were not destroyed. Because of various events, their own individual competence, the fact that the new Jedi Order essentially achieved great victories, all four of them did survive. But their expectation was that that was not going to be the case, and they were hoping that one member, maybe two members, might come out of it with a recollection of what the family had been and carry on that legacy. So what you're looking at is a family that was determined to survive in spite of the fact that most of them would die. And that's your answer. It's a grim answer, but it's an answer.
What do you think should be the role of the Jedi in this galaxy?
Oh, that's a really complicated question, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, it's complicated because first each of them has to think about it individually, and then they have to think of themselves collectively. And when they think of themselves collectively, they have to think in terms of other collectives, such as the government. So it's a state of constant definition. I think that the role of the Jedi is involved heavily in keeping the destructive forces of the universe down to a necessary minimum level, and not trying to impose their own will on their surroundings, because a person's will is intimately tied in with his learning and his prejudices, and therefore can be distinct from what the Force is telling them. When they're really in tune with the Force, they're generally doing the right thing. But when their own perspectives and attitudes and childhood traumas and whatever flavor it, they begin to be capable of making serious mistakes. I really enjoy anyone I'm writing as I'm writing him. I mean, I've enjoyed Jaina. I don't connect as strongly with Luke as with some other characters, but when I am writing him, he's all mine.
I've had kind of an uncomfortable relationship with Mara, starting with the New Jedi Order, and part of that was because of writers who came before me. Mara was not quite herself in the New Jedi Order for a long period of time, and then she was handed off to me, and I said, well, I can either make her back into what she was with Tim, or I can account for the difference, or at least address the difference. And that's what we get back to actually following the arc or the psychology of the character. In the case of Mara, she had been behaving very oddly because of physiological changes to herself from an illness, and then what I must assume were hormonal and other changes that were brought on by her pregnancy. And suddenly she had, in the novel prior to mine, Ben had been kidnapped and restored to her, and I looked at what she had been up until that point and said, well, let's aim her back at the Timothy Zahn Mara. But what I had was a vision of Mara Jade as sort of a brooding raptor. It had a chick that had been endangered, and she was not going to step away from that chick until that danger was alleviated. So she was still suffering an out-of-body experience, an out-of-character experience, but I was pointing her back in the direction of the real Mara Jade. So when people come to me and say, you got her wrong, I say, yes, I did.
But
now
less
look
wrong.
where she was when I took her, and look where she was when I finished with her, and you'll see there's a direction there. And that's one of the things sometimes you have to do when you're handling another writer's character. It's not easy, and you can't always do what amounts to the right thing instantaneously.
So moving on to another Jedi and a non-Jedi, you've been a vocal supporter of Jaina and Jag. So why do you think they're so good together, just besides the fact that they're great pilots?
Excuse me. I think that part of it is that regardless of what they want to be, they are intrinsically hard asses, both of them. Jag is a hard ass from his family background and the environment in which he grew up, and Jaina exactly the same way. And the thing is, if you put them with most other characters romantically, they would tend to overrun them. They tend to trample them down like tanks, whether or not they intended to. I've heard both of them being recommended for relationships with other characters, and I look at that and see, but don't you understand? These two characters are push, push, push. They cannot not push, and therefore they need to be up against people who are like them and push in the other direction. They understand that, they respect that, and even if it causes tension and abrasiveness, they will be able to forgive because they know it is what they themselves are. And so this is why I always advocated Jaina and Jag. I mean, there was also the engineered quality that they were sort of mirror images or reverse images of the relationship of Jaina's parents. I mean, with Jaina's parents, Leia was the princess, and Han the scruffy scoundrel. And when you got to the next generation, Jag was the more elegant and refined sort of individual, and Jaina the girl with grease on her face. So they had that kind of dynamic in reverse, which made them a nice recollection of the Han and Leia relationship, and I thought that would give them a lot of readers and writers thought that would give them a leg up on their relationship. But I really think they work first because they're dynamic characters, second because they understand each other, and third, and possibly most importantly, because it would be hell for them to have a protracted relationship with anyone else.
Why did you have to torture us with the whole Antilles family survival cliffhangers?
Let's be more specific about what exactly he's talking about.
I think just the whole situation in the Enemy Lines books, and just how we don't know if they're going to, if the children have made it, and then torturing us with Wedge.
Well, with the New Jedi Order, with the Enemy Lines duology, what you have to understand is I was brought in pretty much at the midpoint of the series, and I did have a specific assignment. The portion of the overall story arc that I was given was like one paragraph. It read the New Jedi Order, the New Republic reacts to the fall of Coruscant. That was my assignment. But I had a secondary assignment, which was to kind of turn the tone of the series around a little bit. It had been the galaxy was in a handbasket rocketing straight to hell, and I was supposed to suggest that at a certain point the New Republic was going to get traction, dig in its heels, and start to turn around in the other direction. But it was essentially the most desperate hour of the New Republic. Coruscant had fallen. Washington, D.C. had fallen. You know, the American government had fallen. The New Republic government had fallen. It was the desperate hour. And so I wanted the desperation of that moment to permutate throughout every corner of the novel and everything people were feeling. They were in a military environment. They were in an armed camp. They were fighting. And so they had that slight security about them, but they were facing a major Yuuzhan Vong attack, and then that intended to wipe them out. They had targets on them. It was a desperate time, and so that desperation extended even to the children. But I did not play it up in some sort of gross Hollywood fashion where, you know, where Miri and Sile are running around in back corridors with 3 Yuuzhan Vong warriors chasing them and hurling thud bugs at them. I don't approve of endangering children characters unless they are actually in danger. If I have a situation where children characters are in danger, there's probably a 50% chance that they will be killed, because children are not immune to danger. So I don't like that kind of teaser, except when it's Wedge Antilles at the end of the Enemy Lines duology.
Oh man, when I was reading Enemy Lines for the first time and I got to that, I was almost ready to hop a plane to Texas and yell at you. And I got to ask you about that scene with Wedge in the end of the Enemy Lines duology.
Oh yes, the evil
I got a
scene.
feeling you took some glee from that.
I did. You know, but I could afford the glee because I knew I wasn't going to kill Wedge. I wasn't even going to, you know, plausibly show him dying. I was just going to put him in an ever mounting series of desperate actions where the readers would expect, okay, this is it. Oh, okay, this is it. Oh, okay. And yeah, there was a certain amount of snarky glee there. But had I actually intended to kill him in that sequence, I would not have been feeling that. I felt glee because I knew it was a trick, and I knew that when it was all over, they'd be you know, mopping their brows and oh, you bastard, and that was what I was feeling the glee at.
Yes.
You know, each writer who dealt with the Yuuzhan Vong will have created characters within that race that they were fond of, and then more or less immediately killed them in the New Jedi Order series. I know I did with Chulkang La.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I liked the character, but at the end of the Enemy Lines duology, he was dead and buried.
Wherever possible, the writers would accommodate one another in their wishes and perspectives on the way the characters should be utilized, and sometimes it turned out not to be possible. Because in some cases, because the writers had gaffiated well out of the Star Wars universe. Like I used a Barbara Hambly character and killed him in the course of my New Jedi Order stories. I was not able to get in touch with her because the change to the Hambly character took place at the last minute because the character I had originally chosen was disallowed, and so I had to make the substitution. And bang, it was a new guy, and bang, I killed him. And then only later on tracked her down in a convention and said, "I'm sorry, this is why this happened." And she said, "Oh, that's fine."
I've been fairly fortunate in that most of what I've done has been untouched by the prequel trilogy. There were some things in my New Jedi Order novels that did not make it to print because the movies, which were then still being produced, caused these details to be yanked. And I think that they could probably have been restored, you know, years after the fact now that the prequels are done, but don't have to be. So, but I'm pretty content.
Of all the characters you've created and the stories you've written, what do you think is your proudest contribution to the Star Wars mythos?
Early on, I was kind of worried that I wasn't having any sort of effect on the expanded universe at all because my characters and their situations were not really coming up in other people's writings. So it's only a recent consideration of, you know, what effect I might have had I think that the contribution that I'm proudest of is not a single novel, but that I think I have fairly successfully adhered to the tone of the first movie of A New Hope. Its combination of rollicking action and touches of tragedy and lots of humor and Republic serial and pulp magazine sensibilities and brightness. I really try to achieve that in the novels that I do, and I think that at moments I've been able to do it, and that more than any specific novel or specific plot line is what pleases me most. I hope that there are going to be enduring legacies there. I hope that the Wraiths become an enduring legacy, or at least groups like them, because I think that whether or not it's the race, there are always going to be room for that kind of subculture, that kind of group association, and that this will have given people a taste for that.
Thank you again for coming on with us.
Thank you very much.
I was glad to be here, and thanks for the good questions.
Anytime.
You.